Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where it's deadlock in Downing Street, as this week the Cabinet split into two to ponder the alternative approaches to Brexit and a customs arrangement with Europe. Two groups of three senior ministers have been burning the midnight oil, studying respective plans. The sole point of agreement, according to Environment Secretary Michael Gove, is that neither model is absolutely perfect. So in the absence of perfection, can the Prime Minister unite her warring factions to produce a coherent policy on Brexit, almost 2 years after that fateful EU referendum which brought her into power? To govern is to choose. But as an ill-fated Tory Chancellor once said, to be unable to choose is to give the appearance of being unable to govern. This week we look at May's customs conundrum. But first, over to Tasmina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Well, we've had a terrific response to last week's show, particularly in relation to our fantastic young American activists from the US. Weemy says, what amazing, articulate, mature and intelligent young women. I hope they go out into this world and make the changes happen for all our sakes. Alex lets them talk. He's a brilliant host. Bob says, I think maybe Trump lives on feedback. He tweets something outrageous and then reads the feedback, then tracks from there and after working the mumbo-jumbo through his head. Vote Scotty says, Medea Benjamin, we love your 3 wishes. Kieran says, fantastic final show of the USA special, highlighting the rural-urban divide, young-old and the changing demographic of the USA. If only the average Americans were as educated as these lovely young women. Uncle Joseph says, your show is a breath of fresh air. Interesting guests who would never get the chance to highlight their cause and activism on any show in the UK, so more power to you. Thank you, Uncle Joseph. Bob says, I'm no fan of Alex Salmond, but yes, I'd agree 100% that the show is a triumph. For example, the recent programme on Andrew Carnegie. The rambling one the following week, not so good. Well, Bob, I sympathise with you. We're trying to stop Alex from rambling, but it's not easy. Then Susan says, so love the Alex Salmond Show. We need this sense-making conversation daily. Learning loads and feeling cheated by the mainstream TV even more than before. Now I have a picture of what we're missing out on. Here's the Scottish broadcasting taking off. Thank you so much, Susan. Now back to Alex.
From deadlock in Downing Street to gridlock in the Palace of Westminster, where the barons and baronesses of this realm are cutting up rough on the government Brexit Bill. Having overturned the government no less than 14 times on the legislation, is this a case of the peers against the people, or is it in fact the House of Lords who have caught the public mood? Today we look at the government's Brexit dilemma through the lens of that island beyond this island, the island of Ireland, because behind Theresa May's Brexit bourach is her inability to solve the Irish enigma of how to manage Brexit Britain with no border in Ireland. No one who watched our trilogy of programmes on Ireland at the start of this year will be at all surprised at the government's present and dangerous dilemma. The 3 key figures we interviewed then poured scorn on the UK proposals. This is what they had to say.
What David Davies liked to mention is the American-Canadian border. But I don't know why he keeps mentioning that, because all you have to do is Google it and you'll see the massive queues of traffic waiting for the checkpoints. So that's precisely, the example he uses is precisely our fear.
I listened to Theresa May and I listened to others from the English Tories saying that don't worry about the border in Ireland. Ireland will be fine, on the one hand, and then insisting that Britain will leave the customs union, leave the single market, and so on. And of course, the reality is that those two positions are completely at odds with each other. I think the Tories have played a very dangerous game. No way can Ireland, or should Ireland, or will Ireland be the collateral damage in the midst of all of that.
My worry is, of course, that some of the paramilitaries, the smaller operations, have not gone away. They do not enjoy public support, but give them a cause. And that cause could be a camera on a border. It could be a mobile patrol on a border. Because here's the thing. We now enjoy a completely open and free border. After Brexit, whatever we get will be less than that.
So are the government caught between the Irish rock and some very hard cases among the Brexiteers and in the Democratic Unionist Party on whom they depend for their Commons majority. I asked John Tong, Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool, how much of the European impasse is being dictated by the border politics of Ireland. How surprised are you, Professor Tong, that the Prime Minister has reached this impasse on the customs union issue?
I'm not surprised at all. This was always going to be the major problem. And basically, Theresa May is now casting around for solutions which frankly appear unworkable anyway and would almost certainly be rejected by the European Union and by the Irish government. It doesn't matter whether it's the so-called max-fac solution, maximum facilitation, which frankly is a betrayal of what the government initially said, because initially they said that there would be no new infrastructure at the border, but max-fac relies upon the installation of new technology. So it's inconceivable that's going to be accepted, or whether you go for the customs partnership arrangement in which you get the bizarre spectacle of the UK leaving the European Union and yet still collecting the EU's taxes or tariffs and basically reimbursing traders. Neither is a very practical solution. Neither addresses the essential problem of a reinvigorated border, which the vast bulk of people on the island of Ireland do not want. Whether you go for max-fac, whether you go for customs partnership, you do have a stronger border. And that was what we were told simply would not happen.
And is it the issue of the Irish border that's very much at the heart of this customs dilemma?
Absolutely. And it was Theresa May who said in the Brexit referendum campaign, in one of the very few utterances about that border, it was Theresa May herself who said it was inconceivable that the border could remain the same. But if you go back to December, it was quite clear what the agreement was between the UK, Ireland and the EU, that there would be full regulatory and customs alignment if a satisfactory deal could not be found between Britain and Ireland. And we're still miles away from a satisfactory arrangement between Britain and Ireland. So the default position will be full customs and regulatory alignment. That simply has to take place. And Britain is almost friendless on this.
And isn't it remarkable, Professor Tong, that the small island of Ireland, or at least the Irish interest for no border, has marshalled the total solidarity of the European negotiators? And do you see that situation changing?
Yeah, it used to be said the Irish question dominated British politics, but the Irish question is dominating European Union politics now because, you know, frankly, the UK is almost bereft of allies on this issue. All the sympathy across Europe lies with Ireland. The fact is that the border, whilst it was silent, whilst it was a political fact rather than offence, most people could tolerate that. Most European Union countries acknowledged and hailed the Good Friday Agreement as a fantastic piece of peacemaking. Its architects won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was internationally lauded. For a government to try and drive a coach and horses through that agreement, really, you know, we will be considered as reckless by the vast bulk of European Union countries. The all-Ireland dimension of the Good Friday Agreement, Strand 2, makes little sense in the context of Brexit. The Good Friday Agreement was predicated upon seamless cross-border trade, and therefore, you know, although the Good Friday Agreement only assumed common EU membership, it really is struggling to function once the actuality of Brexit takes place, assuming it goes ahead on the 29th of March 2019. And that's unacceptable. You've got to remember the Good Friday Agreement was voted for by huge majorities on both parts of the island of Ireland. It was supported right across the globe. Frankly, countries are not going to stand aside and simply see the Good Friday Agreement torn asunder by a unilateral action from the United Kingdom.
Now, Mr. Barnier is a well-read man, but do you think he's familiar with the Churchill quote that the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone are now dominating British landscape? Are you saying they now dominate the politics of the continent of Europe?
Michel Barnier and the European Union more broadly have been insistent almost from day one, the day after the referendum took place, that they will stand by Ireland and that on the border question there has to be a solution that is acceptable to the Republic of Ireland. They've not budged from that position. Now, the UK government has come up with a whole variety of slogans and cliches since that referendum, saying there will be no return to a hard border, there'll be no infrastructure. The British government's already hinting that it's rowing back from that no new infrastructure because it's talking about technological solutions. Well, technology has to be put in place somewhere. I wouldn't want to be the first person trying to install border installations. It's not just, you know, myself that would say that. The Chief Constable of Northern Ireland has warned that it would be reckless to try and install anything at the border, to try and reinvigorate a border. You know, there was a conflict about that border that cost 3,600 lives only recently. To try and reactivate a border which was, you know, which had largely gone silent, and where people, whether they be unionists or nationalists on the island of Ireland, were enjoying the benefits of seamless cross-border trade and activity, to try and jeopardise that by making the border more than a political fact and turning it into something more serious. You know, I think it's damaging. You've already seen the damage it's done to British-Irish relations, which had hugely improved at governmental level in the context of shared EU membership. You can almost trace the improvement in relations to the day they both joined the EU, way back in January 1973. You saw the contribution of the European Union in terms of massive peace programmes which benefited the situation in Northern Ireland. Now what you've got is, you know, the first really retrograde step that reinvigorates a border which has long been unpopular.
And finally, Professor Tong, the Prime Minister has a divided cabinet. The House of Lords is in revolt. Scotland and Wales are not happy, and the Irish border issue is dominating all. How long has Theresa May got to come up with a solution? Well, time is ticking. I mean, the EU want this solved by June this year. I suspect the latest the British government could push it back would be October. The government is getting defeated readily in the House of Lords. 14 amendments, 14 defeats for the government within 1 week, some of them very serious defeats. I think it will be difficult for the government to reverse all of those defeats in the House of Commons, even with DUP support. Frankly, there are enough Conservatives who are pro-membership, retaining our membership of the customs union, for them to inflict a defeat upon the government. So for all the bombast of the government's initial white paper, which says we will be leaving the customs union, I'm not sure there's a majority there in Parliament for the government to get that through. So the chances are the UK will remain part of the customs union, will be unable to conduct these wonderful free trade deals that we were promised, will retain a lot of adherence to the European Union, and in some ways it's the worst of all worlds. We leave the EU, we give up all the influence that we had within the European Union, and don't really gain any influence or sovereignty ourselves. Then there's the issue of Scotland, and obviously the Scottish Parliament withholding legislative consent, the first time that it's done that for any Westminster item, and the embarrassment of that. And you've got to remember that the bulk of Scots did not vote for Brexit in the same way that the bulk of the Northern Irish did not vote for it. And frankly, there's been no respect given to either of those countries in terms of what they said in terms of the Brexit referendum. Instead, Westminster's tried to steamroller ahead and has got into ever greater difficulty in resolving these questions. So ultimately, we're looking at a scenario in which the Brexiteers will not get their way. I'm fairly clear. I also don't think they've got the power to bring down Theresa May either. And what you'll have is a softer Brexit than what was originally envisaged. Professor John Tong of the University of Liverpool, thank you so much for being on the Alex Salmond Show. My pleasure. Welcome back to this Brexit special where we're looking at Theresa May's customs union dilemma. I'm joined by Kate Hoey, prominent Labour Member of Parliament, a pro-Brexiteer, but someone with a great interest in the Irish issue. Kate, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. You're a pro-Brexit Labour Member of Parliament with a strong interest in Irish affairs. What's your assessment of Theresa May's customs union dilemma?
Well, I think she's
getting herself into a bit of a mess because the arrangement, customs arrangement, she's absolutely determined not to stay in the customs union, but the customs arrangement is incredibly difficult and technical and has been very much ruled out already by the EU, and I think has been ruled out by probably the majority of her MPs. So I think that's out. Remember, there is a border there in Northern Ireland. It may not be seen, but there's an excise border, there's a border on currency, there's a border on all those kind of things, and it's all dealt with remotely and doesn't have any physical structures.
To what extent has the Downing Street been caught by surprise by how strongly the Irish border issue has emerged in the negotiations?
Well, it's emerged because the Irish government changed its Taoiseach, and the new Taoiseach has made this a big issue for his own political reasons, and also because he wants to be seen very much as backing the EU. The previous Taoiseach was already involved in committees looking at technological solutions. He stopped all that, and I think Varadkar is using the border now and the Belfast Agreement, Good Friday Agreement, as a way of trying to force the United Kingdom into staying in the customs union, which of course would be totally against everything that we voted for, because if you stay in the customs union, you don't have your access to trade, you have to follow the EU law, and you have to pay money. So it's not leaving the EU.
But have you been surprised by the extent to which the Taoiseach has managed to marshal the entire negotiating team of the European Union behind his cause?
No, I'm not surprised, because the Irish have always had played a very clever role in the EU. After all, they got millions of pounds over many years. They're now beginning to become a net contributor, and that might change the attitude of the public. But no, I'm not surprised. And the EU, the Commission, have seen the Northern Ireland border as a way again of trying to thwart Brexit. I mean, they really do think that if this keeps going on, that eventually people will say, let's have another referendum. That is not going to happen.
And finally, Kate, if Theresa May manages to unite her cabinet, a big if perhaps, and then presents something to the Commons, does she then will have a majority to overturn the pro-customs union vote from the House of Lords?
Yes, and the customs union vote in the House of Lords was a very peculiar kind of wording. It wasn't actually saying stay in the customs union. But yes, I think the more important one coming back from the Lords, of course, is the date, to keep the date in. They took the date out. And I would just say something that most people don't talk about, that I think there will be a lot more Labour MPs who will abstain. There were a number of Labour MPs who abstained last time. Gets hardly noticed, but after the council elections, after what's happened up in Leave areas, I think we'll find that a lot of people will say we're not going to let the Lords actually try to really give us Brexit in name only.
But you're a Labour woman to your fingertips. Are you really going to come to the rescue of a beleaguered Tory Prime Minister?
I'd be coming to the rescue of the people of this country who voted to leave. No ifs and buts to leave, and also I think to help Jeremy Corbyn, who has stuck in a very difficult situation to what was in our manifesto and what he knows is long-term the right thing for this country.
Kate Hoey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Kate Hoey demonstrating that pro-Brexit views are not confined to the Tory benches, and that Northern Ireland Unionist views are not confined to the DUP. This is what the Prime Minister had to say on the issue earlier this week.
We want to ensure that we are able to continue to trade in as frictionless a way as possible. And the suggestion that trade at the moment is entirely frictionless is actually not correct. But we have set three very simple objectives for a future customs union. Now, I will say to this House that achieving those objectives, which I've just set out, is not easy. It is difficult. There will be some who will say, actually, forget about an independent trade policy. That is not the position of this government. There may be some who say, don't worry about the Northern Irish border. That is not the position of this government.
That was Theresa May at Prime Minister's Questions yesterday. I'm now joined in the studio by Sinn Féin member of the European Parliament, Martina Anderson. Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, Martina.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Now, Ireland as a whole, not just the Sinn Féin, but have been really successful in getting European Parliament members, indeed the European Commission, to to support Ireland's objectives in the Brexit negotiations. I mean, how have you managed that?
Well, I would actually say that it has been Sinn Féin. It's been Sinn Féin that has brought the Irish government and also the European Parliament and the Council to understand the importance of the Good Friday Agreement, an international agreement that's lodged at the United Nations. And the European Parliament has a duty and an obligation to uphold international treaties, and they can't do anything that's going to facilitate the damage or violations of them.
So how much knowledge was there of the Good Friday Agreement among, you know, the hundreds of European parliamentarians?
Absolutely none. I have to say that, other than the fact, in fairness to the MEPs that were there, all of them seen it in the context of a peace accord, a handshake. When we went on a diplomatic offensive almost leading up to the referendum, because no one was talking about Ireland, everyone was talking about Scotland. Everyone was talking about Scotland during the debate, and even the British government, like we were an afterthought. Even I don't even think we were an afterthought. That said, we went on a diplomatic offensive, tried to ensure that we could garner support for the Remain vote, and we did that in the north. But then after the referendum, Martin McGuinness led that offensive for us in the European Parliament, and we met with hundreds and hundreds of MEPs. I personally have sat down with them all. And when the first resolution came to the Parliament after Article 50 was triggered, I am one of the lead negotiators for the left on Brexit for the group that we're a member of. And I resisted us signing up to the joint resolution unless and until we secured that it would protect the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts, that there would be no hardening of the border in Ireland, and the unique and special circumstances were taken into account. In fairness, when the 516 MEPs voted for that across the Parliament, those that didn't consisted of the two other Unionist MEPs, UKIP and British Conservatives. But all of the other parliamentary MEPs that were there, they supported it, but they didn't really understand what all of its parts meant. So I took from April until the second resolution in October, knocking on MEPs' doors. And it was one of the reasons why, when we first knocked at the doors, we asked them for support for designated special status for the North to remain within the EU.
And this is the pamphlet you produced as a pocket guide for European parliamentarians.
We then went to them, and because they didn't understand the different strands of the agreement, so we says, here, it's my wee Good Friday Agreement. Because Unionism and the British government was saying that the EU didn't feature in the Good Friday Agreement. Well, it actually features 15 times throughout the agreement.
And in your opinion, were you able to convince people that Brexit was, by jeopardising the Good Friday Agreement, was potentially putting the peace at risk? I mean, you yourself were released from prison as a result of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, I think someone like myself personifies what we as Irish Republicans, how much not just that we have stretched ourselves, but what we have done throughout this peace and political process that we have been engaged in. And I think people could see where we're at now, and where we intend to go, and there was to be no damage done to the agreement. In the second resolution of the Parliament was very clear. And the Parliament voted not just for the Good Friday Agreement's protection in all of its parts, but it also said that if Britain did not remain in the custom union and the single market, that the North needed to in some form. So the Parliament at that time, there were 560 MEPs, and that's because they understood that we couldn't have two divergent standards of European regulations in an island if they were going to preserve strand 2, the All-Ireland element of the Good Friday Agreement. So there's overwhelming support for Ireland, not just in the Parliament, but also in the Council as well.
The Chief Constable of Northern Ireland has said recently that if there's any physical infrastructure at the border, then that becomes a potential target for terrorism. Do you agree with him?
The war's over, and we need to be clear about that. And there is no support whatsoever in Ireland, north or south, for a return to conflict. That said, we shouldn't ignore what the Chief Constable has said, and what we need to do is ensure that there are no circumstances created that would allow anyone to exploit the situation. The British government is a co-guarantor of a peace process, as with the Irish government, and it's lodged at the United Nations. And so when the British government said in the joint report in December that there would be no physical infrastructure, no checks, no controls at the border at all in Ireland, that they would do that with a backstop arrangement if they didn't have the other two options, and they haven't secured those so far. And the backstop was going to ensure that we would have full alignment with the custom union and the single market for the island, for the north, that we would do so to support the areas of cooperation in Ireland. As well as that, we would also support the Good Friday Agreement and the All-Ireland economy. But most importantly, and no one's really talking about it apart from Sinn Féin, but they will, there would be no diminution of our rights. There'd be no reduction of our rights.
As far as Sinn Féin's concerned, the war is over.
The war is over. Of that there is no doubt. And the Republican movement in Ireland that has got support for driving the peace and political process, and Sinn Féin now under the leadership of our President, Mary Lou McDonald, will be driving forward a scenario for Irish unity, done so in a way based on the principle of consent. The principle of consent was built into the Good Friday Agreement, and that was something that we all have to be very clear about, that the constitutional position of the North should not change unless we consent to it. Well, we didn't consent to this. We voted to remain within the EU.
Martina Anderson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
2 years ago, during the European referendum campaign, it's doubtful that any one of the Brexiteers gave a second thought to what was going to happen to Ireland if they achieved their ambition and a majority in the referendum. Far less thought it would be the stumbling block to their ambitions. But that is now exactly what has happened. Theresa May doesn't have her problems to seek. She has a split cabinet. The Lords are revolting. Scotland and Wales are deeply unhappy. But it is the Irish issue and the issue of the Irish border which is transcending the negotiations. The European Union had three objectives when they started the negotiating process. One was to make sure that Britain paid its dues. Two was to guarantee and protect the rights of European citizens. They have been achieved. And the third was to make sure there was no border in Ireland. Now, I had no doubt 2 years ago when campaigning in Derry that a hard Brexit was incompatible with a soft border in Ireland, and that chicken is now well and truly home to roost. Perhaps not for the first time in British politics. What Churchill called the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone have emerged to dominate the landscape. Because whatever else Theresa May has to worry about, there is no doubt that that island beyond the island of Ireland, now has the key cards in the negotiations.